In this lesson, we are going to be taking a look at texture settings and TXmanager. So let's start with texture settings. Open up the render settings window, and under main tab you have texture options. The first thing I want to do for now is to disable auto convert texture to TX for now. Before going through, I want to make sure you understand what is MIP mapping. MIP mapping is an approach to texture mapping in which an original high resolution texture map is scaled and filtered into multiple resolutions before it is applied to a surface. The texture can appear in full detail if it is seen in a close-up, or can be rendered quickly and smoothly from a lower MIP or MIP level when the object appears smaller or further away. So when a texture is MIP mapped, it would be available for the engine in different resolutions, and based on how close or far we are from that particular texture, certain resolutions would be used. Formats like EXR, TIFF support MIP mapping, and formats like JPEG won't, obviously. All the textures that I have used in the scenes are PNG or JPEG textures and unMIPed or unMIP mapped. I'll be coming back for these first two options in a moment, but for now let's continue on. We have accept unMIPed. When enabled, Arnold will accept unMIPed files and allow the render. If I uncheck accept unMIPed and try to render, you can see the render will fail because obviously all the files and the textures are in JPEG or PNG in the scene and they are not MIP mapped. Let me press OK and close the picture viewer for now. We have auto MIP map. If a texture is not MIP mapped like the textures we are using in the scene, having this option enabled will generate a MIP map for that texture. So if you have a scene with tons of unMIPed textures, having auto MIP map turned on will generate a MIP map for those textures, and it increases render time. We have accept untiled. So if the texture is not tiled, if this option is enabled, Arnold allowed the render, and if I disable and attempt to render, because the textures in the scene are in JPEG or PNG format and they do not support tile mode, the render will fail. Let's disable it and try to render our scene. And as you can see, the render failed error has appeared. And the reason this error message appears, if I get back to our diagnostics tab in the render setting, we have this abort on error enabled. And if I disable it and render my scene, you can see the scene is going to render, but whenever we have a texture, we see this red color all over the place, which is a texture error color. Let me just close the picture viewer and enable abort on error and get back to the texture settings. We have auto tile. If enabled, Arnold will generate tiles for untiled textures in 64 by 64 pixels dimensions. You can change the tile size down here to whatever you want. Those tiles will be saved, and if just a certain part of the texture is going to be visible, Arnold will just use those necessary tiles of the texture. And this tiling process obviously is going to again increase the render time when you are dealing with tons of high resolution untiled textures. So that is why in Arnold you should always, especially when you are dealing with a lot of high resolution textures, use textures in formats that are MIP mapped and tiled, and those data already saved in those texture files. Now the format Arnold suggests to use is .tx, which is Arnold's proprietary file format. .tx is basically EXR or TIFF files, which has been renamed to .tx file, but the .tx also has some extra attributes. The next option here is this use existing .tx textures. If enabled, Arnold checks for the .tx versions of the textures referenced in the scene and exports them to Arnold. So for example, I can convert these PNG or JPEG textures that I have in my scene to .tx textures, and if this option is enabled, even though you have referenced those PNG or JPEG files in your shader network, Arnold still uses the .tx versions of those textures. The way you convert your images to .tx format is using either these auto convert textures to .tx or using the TXmanager. So if I open up the TXmanager window from C4D2A plugin menu, as you can see, all the textures used in the scene are listed here, and they are all in the PNG or JPEG format. Also, if I go to the text folder that contains the textures for this lesson, you can see we have no TX versions of the textures yet. I can select all of these textures in the TXmanager and then click on create, and this way create the TX versions for these textures. Or the easier way is to turn on auto convert option in the render settings, which is enabled by default. So if I enable this option and render the scene, you can see we have this pre-render phase in which the engine converts or creates the TX versions of the available textures. And obviously this happens once. When those TX files are created, the next render will happen immediately. Now in the TXmanager, if I click on this refresh button, this left column here indicates that the TX version now is available for all the textures in the scene. Also in the text folder for this lesson, you can see we have .tx files now available for the existing textures. To use those existing .tx textures, simply disable autoconvert because we don't need it anymore, and enable the use existing .tx textures. Now if you start the render will start immediately, and those .tx files will be used instead of the original JPEG or PNG files, which is very efficient for rendering. Now let's get back to our texture settings and take a look at these options here. We have max cache size, which is the amount of memory used for caching the textures. We have max open files, which is the maximum number of files that the texture system keeps open at any given time. It is set to 0, so there is no limitation, and the only one is your operating system and the maximum number of open files it can handle. We have diffuse blur, which controls the amount of blur in texture lookups for diffuse rays, and specular blur, which controls the amount of blur in texture lookups for specular rays. So that is about texture settings and TXmanager in Arnold for Cinema 4D. See you in the next lesson.